BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Knitheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Tuesday, and on Tuesdays I talk to you guys about the story of JonBenet Ramsey, perhaps the most famous unsolved crime in American history. And in this episode, I will be looking at the possible involvement from Fleet White Jr. in this crime, continuing with Paula Woodward's book, We Have Your Daughter, and of course, the Lou Smith File. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about JonBenet Ramsey. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Now, the namesake for today's episode is very simple. I will look at some stories involving Fleet White Jr. However, I don't want this episode to be purely thought of as, did Fleet White have anything to do with JonBenet's murder? Instead, I would like to use it as one where we're going to examine his involvement in the story of JonBenet Ramsey, because Fleet White is one of the witnesses to the discovery of JonBenet's body. And I think that there's a very solid introduction that has been created. Fleet White was a close friend of the Ramseys and was present on December 26 of 1996 when John Ramsey found the body of his daughter JonBenet in their Boulder, Colorado home. White assisted in the search of the basement at the request of the police. He and his wife Priscilla were initially key witnesses, but later grew critical of the investigation and the Ramseys' behavior. And this is going to be one of the most shocking things in the story. Of course, JonBenet was last seen on December 25th of 1996. I should say last seen alive. Her parents claimed that they brought her home from the Christmas party, put her to bed, and on December 26th of 1996, she was found in the basement of her Boulder, Colorado home. She had been beaten in the head, strangled, and also sexually assaulted with a paintbrush, and the two people who were searching for her in the basement were John Ramsey and Fleet White. But Fleet White is going to have somewhat of a reversal about his opinion of the Ramseys, and he's going to go from being a friend to someone who is going to heavily question their behavior. Let's look at the key details. Discovery of the body. At approximately 1 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, Detective Linda Arndt asked John Ramsey and Fleet White to search the house for anything amiss. They checked the basement where John opened a latch door and found JonBenet's body. And to be very clear, it is John who finds the body of JonBenet Ramsey, but Fleet White was in the basement as well. Initial witness. White was one of the first people at the house that morning after the 911 call was made regarding the ransom note. So this would have happened hours earlier. Patsy Ramsey wakes up. She claims that she redid her makeup, contrary to popular belief, but that's something that she shared in her book, The Death of Innocence. She went down their spiral staircase, saw the 2.5-page ransom note, went up to tell John, and then Patsy's the one who calls 911, and then the Whites would have come over relatively soon after that. Not immediately, of course, because that would have happened in roughly the early AM hours. Shift in perspective. Although close to the family, White and his wife grew frustrated with the Ramseys' lack of cooperation with the Boulder police and stopped cooperating with the investigation themselves, eventually calling for a special prosecutor. Now, I also want to be very clear about some things. Fleet White is going to go on to become a suspect. If you have looked at anything in the JonBenet Ramsey case, you're probably aware of that. And some people have their theories about how it was Fleet White the whole time, and other people will have the theory that it was Fleet White and John Ramsey working together and the families were covering for them. But I want to be crystal clear about something. I do not think that this statement right here implies any guilt on the part of the Whites, and I'm going to read that for you once again. They grew frustrated with the Ramseys' lack of cooperation with the Boulder police and stopped cooperating with the investigation themselves, eventually calling for a special prosecutor. That does not indicate guilt. That does not indicate innocence. That indicates exactly what it says it indicates: frustration. And it also indicates suspicion. It sounds like the Whites were growing very suspicious of the Ramseys. And no matter what the outcome is, no matter what your theory is on the JonBenet Ramsey case, it seems like they had suspicions because they were only human. And lastly, public scrutiny. Because of their presence, the whites were questioned, but they were never considered primary suspects by the police in the murder investigation. And again, I really wanted this episode not to be about overly trying to vilify the whites. They're not my top suspects, and I can explain some of the reasons why they're not my top suspects throughout the duration of this episode. But I also want to be clear about something else. The police never consider them suspects. It is very hard to take the Boulder Police Department seriously because they botched the investigation. That is maybe that is the biggest reason why this is still the most famous unsolved crime in American history, because the authorities botched the investigation. So everything that they did was incorrect, inappropriate, out of line, unprofessional, going against procedure, created the possibilities for contamination of the crime scene, of the Ramsey house, of JonBenet's body, all of that. So I really don't put too much stock in the opinions of just general statements that are made under the umbrella of, well, the police never considered them. However, maybe for some future episodes, I will look at some more specific comments that were made from members of law enforcement, but in general terms, I'm not overly impressed with anything that they have put forward to date. Now, there is another article that was written on factualamerica.com about Fleet White and his involvement in the Ramsey case and the story of JonBenet Ramsey. One more time, factualamerica.com, just citing the source. And this is a website that I've never used before here on Black Box Online Radio. I always like finding new resources for the channel, and I talk about a lot of other unsolved mysteries on Black Box Online Radio, such as the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, the Black Dahlia, and D.B. Cooper. So if you're new to this program and you're new to my episodes, feel free to hit the like button and subscribe one more time, and also check out some of the other content here if you're curious about unsolved mysteries. Let's look at the factualamerica.com article. Fleet White Jr., a close friend of the Ramseys, became an important witness in the case. He was present at the Ramsey house when JonBenet's body was found. White initially supported the Ramseys, but later became critical of their behavior and the investigation. He wrote open letters expressing concerns about the handling of the Ramsey case. Other key witnesses included neighbors who reported unusual sounds or sightings on the night of the murder. However, conflicting accounts made it difficult to establish a clear timeline of events. Now, what this story is in regards to the sounds around the time of the murder, one of the neighbors complained that they heard a sound roughly, even before midnight, of a female scream, and that would be consistent with JonBenet being attacked before she went to bed, or that would just throw a giant wrench in the timeline that was established by the Ramseys, saying that they brought her home from the Christmas party. They brought JonBenet home. She was asleep in the car. John Ramsey was carrying her. She was wearing the red turtleneck, and she was put to bed. And, if there was this female scream that happened before midnight, that would be extremely questionable. But it's not like anybody had the clock or the stopwatch, or they had any type of recording of this alleged scream. So that becomes a very flimsy piece of evidence no matter what. But that's what I believe that this article is talking about. So let's keep going here, though, with this Factual America article, because they really want to expand on the actions and activities of the White family. Fleet White and his wife Priscilla were close friends of the Ramseys. They were present at the Ramsey house on December 26 of 1996 when JonBenet's body was discovered. However, their relationship with the Ramseys soured over time. Fleet became critical of how the case was handled. He wrote an open letter expressing frustration with the investigation's directions. The Whites were never formally named as suspects, yet their involvement in the case and subsequent actions drew public attention and speculation. JonBenet's parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, faced intense scrutiny throughout the investigation. They were considered suspects by some investigators and members of the public. Key points of suspicion include the ransom note, allegedly written on paper from the Ramsey house, inconsistencies in their statements, and their behavior following the discovery of JonBenet's body. The Ramseys consistently maintained their innocence, and in 2008 they were officially cleared by the Boulder District Attorney's Office based on DNA evidence. And, some people just simply do not accept that. They just simply do not believe that that is something that is one of the ways that somebody should be exonerated. And the long and short of that is that a lot of people have doubts. But let's hear some more things, though, about Fleet White's involvement and, some of the theories involving his greater involvement in the case. And this one is actually going to come to us from a different source, and this will be from page The JonBenet Ramsey Murder, Searching for a Killer. Here's a nagging question I have. Has anyone looked into Fleet White? He was with JonBenet in the evening hours before her murder. That means that he was there at the Christmas party. He's even entertaining the Ramseys at the Christmas party. And she was so tired, meaning JonBenet, she was so tired she didn't wake up on the way home, nor when her parents put her to bed. Could he have given her a sedative? He lived just a few minutes away from the Ramsey home, and he was with John when the body was discovered. Could he have come over in the night? He would have been familiar with the house, and he could have easily persuaded her to come down the stairs. Now, I told you guys that I didn't want to make this into the episode of JonBenet Ramsey Suspect Fleet White Jr., and I don't. But let's look at these as questions that have genuinely been asked. Let's look at these as serious questions that have been posed in an unsolved murder investigation. Could he have given her a sedative? Well, I suppose anything is possible. He lived just a few minutes away from the Ramsey home, and he was with John when her body was discovered. Could he have come over in the night? Once again, I suppose that anything's possible, but if Fleet White is your suspect in this scenario, that he drugged JonBenet, well, it doesn't necessarily seem like the drugs would have been, necessary if he's just going to lure her into the basement by waking her up and taking her downstairs because he's familiar with her. I do have one major problem with that, and that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. He would have been familiar with the house, and he could have easily persuaded her to come downstairs with him. Well, then, what would be the point of the sedative? Just making her groggy, I suppose? And that really is something that has not been completely elaborated on there. But with familiarity, it sounds like the sedative would be somewhat unnecessary, and it seems like if he had this whole twisted plot, then he could just get her in the basement and subdue her by a different means. But you guys can let me know what you think. Please put your ideas in the comment section down below. And it continues by saying, there are several bright and analytical people who have well researched the case and are detail-focused on Fleet White as a suspect. Look at Fleet White's history, especially with his father's connections. They don't discuss that further, though, here. Look at who was staying at his house at the time of the murder and who he was calling from the Ramsey house. Look at how he and his wife behaved, how narcissistic they became with the district attorney and GJ. Look at White's status compared to the Ramseys. Look what they are focused on. In particular, White seemed to have a jealousy issue and resentment of John. Well, now that's just without providing supporting points, this post is kind of venturing off into the world of information gaps. Look how they behaved. If this is talking about writing the open letters and calling out the Ramseys for not participating in the investigation the way they believe they should have participated, I don't necessarily think that there's anything narcissistic about that. If somebody is in this intense situation, this horribly tragic situation, and they begin to be suspicious of the people who are involved, I just think we're only human, and they're going to have their genuine concerns. We know the cops weren't interested in any theory that didn't involve a Ramsey, except for Lou Smith, who was by far the superior, sane, rational, credentialed, and seasoned investigator in the case. No comparison. Well, as we're going to see very easily, Lou Smith is the loudest voice in the intruder theory, but also he really was persuaded by the Ramseys to start investigating the case from their point of view on their side. And let's not kid ourselves, Lou Smith was trying to clear and exonerate the Ramseys. His variant of the intruder theory was meant to make it look like they were not guilty. And, he has the right to do that. He has the right to interpret the evidence in a way that he believes. Lou Smith, of course, has passed away, but he is the subject of the Lou Smith file, which I use to conclude these episodes. However, this statement continues. The Whites' original statements apply to the Ramseys, and they also have an alibi for them. Quoting Fleet White in a statement dated December 29, 1996, is especially hilarious when you consider the made-up garbage about Burke being jealous of JonBenet. Well, now that is, not necessarily made-up garbage. There are real issues that suggest that Burke had problems with JonBenet, and I'm not even talking about the story about him hitting her in the face with the golf club. I mean, that is a story. How about the scatological disorder? How about him putting feces on her items in her room, including the box of chocolate? I mean, wouldn't he... It definitely seems like Burke is showing some resentment and bizarre behaviors and antagonistic behaviors toward JonBenet, and also the whole concept of how JonBenet became the central focus of their mother's life with the beauty pageants, whereas Burke had to be put on the back burner. Quotation here from the Post. There's absolutely nothing about the Ramsey family. There's absolutely nothing about the Ramsey family that I know of, and there's nothing about Patsy, nothing about John, nothing about JonBenet or Burke. And I believe they're quoting Fleet White here when it says, I mean, there's absolutely nothing that you could say about the Ramseys that is bad or worrying. Well, that's something that he said at one point. Then he's going to end up being suspicious. Well, if he actually had these suspicions, I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. And ultimately, I'm not necessarily noting that there's anything that stands out to me that it sounds extremely dangerous and malicious about Fleet White, but I have heard from other people in the past that they have Fleet White as their top suspect because he found the body. Or let's be clear, he was in the basement when John Ramsey found the body. So it's either Fleet did it, or Fleet and John did it together, and the families are covering for each other. But this is something that we do genuinely experience in the true crime world. Somebody has to find the body. JonBenet's body was left in the family house. It was only a matter of time before her body was going to be discovered. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was Fleet White. But I would actually like to look at an article from the Daily Camera called Fleet White Claims Bias in Ramsey Case, and this one was written by Christopher Anderson, just citing the source. A former friend of John and Patsy Ramsey is raising questions about Lieutenant Governor Gail Schuttler's relationship with the parents of JonBenet Ramsey, who are under investigation in connection with their daughter's murder. I mean, it must absolutely feel terrible if one of your friends is going to have a falling out with you after your kid has been murdered and they begin to suspect you of some type of wrongdoing. I mean, if the Ramseys were in that position, that must feel terrible, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that Fleet was guilty. That means he suspected the Ramseys. On Monday, Boulder resident Fleet White issued a second letter in a week addressed to the people of Colorado. He said Schuttler's husband had made several phone calls to John Ramsey in the days immediately following the murder. John Ramsey and the governor's husband, Don Stevens, the managing director for the Institute for International Business at the University of Colorado, are longtime friends and former fraternity brothers at Michigan State University. Schuttler, who is the 1998 Democratic candidate for governor, said that the calls were to offer condolences and to learn about funeral arrangements. So it sounds like Fleet White may have developed some suspicions about John Ramsey's high-ranking connections and began to think that there was some type of misconduct going on. In an August 17th letter, Fleet White made his second request to remove District Attorney Alex Hunter from the case. Both requests were denied, as was a similar request from the Boulder police detective, who resigned from the department, saying the prosecutor's office was mishandling the case. If Schuttler is elected, it is possible that she would be asked to intervene in the case. But it ultimately sounds like Fleet White was thinking that, John Ramsey is somebody who was the CEO of Access Graphics, someone who had connections to Lockheed Martin, and apparently connections to the governor of California, and these odd, suspicious circumstances around JonBenet's death raised the alarm bell for him. But, well, how exactly would this scenario play out? She leaves the Christmas party Fleet waits for everybody to go to bed, goes over to her house, and then brings her to the basement. I don't think the sedative would be involved with that. And furthermore, I mean, they apparently have all of this DNA evidence in the Ramsey case. Wouldn't that be something that they could use to connect to Fleet White if he were indeed the killer? I mean, we're talking about DNA under the fingernails, DNA in the crotch of JonBenet's panties, on the waistband, and possibly in the knot that was used to make the makeshift garrote. JonBenet was found strangled in the basement of her parents' Boulder home on December 26th. Both parents, who have denied involvement in their daughter's death, have remained under suspicion. The case has been plagued with suspicions about relationships, including those between the prosecution and Ramsey defense attorneys. And I think this article is trying to write it from the perspective of Fleet White when they're saying that, all right, he's just looking at these interconnected arrangements that the Ramseys seem to have with not only the governor, but also members of law enforcement and the legal system. And he's like, now wait a second, what's going on? As I said, that sounds like something that a lot of people would probably be suspicious of. So, who helped John Ramsey search the house on the day that the little girl was found dead? Fleet White Jr., and he claims to be a key witness in the case and attacks the handling of the investigation and questions a web of relationships that he suggests are delaying justice in the cold case. So overall, though, I totally get why he might have some suspicions, but at the same time, those are just suspicions. These things sound very emotional. And I hope I wasn't trying to make it sound like, well, Fleet White is wrong because he hasn't identified the right member of the Ramsey family or something like that. And I hope I wasn't trying to make it sound like, oh, well, Fleet White is clearly right about everything. Instead, I just very simply wanted to make the case that he was somebody who had his own ideas. He was somebody who encountered this tragic situation. He was friends with two people. Their daughter was found murdered in the basement, and he questioned the way that they were responding to the investigation. And do you know who else did that? Do you know who else questioned the actions and activities of the Ramseys? Literally all of America. Everybody was thinking, now, what's going on with these parents? Everything about them seems suspicious. Are they hiding something? Well, somebody like Fleet White, as you just heard, began to look. Now, wait, John Ramsey has connections to the governor, the legal systems, and to the business sector, of course. So once again, being the CEO of Access Graphics and working with Lockheed Martin and defense contractors. And it seems like something shady is going on here. And the Whites would ultimately have a falling out with the Ramseys. However, that doesn't mean that is not enough to generate guilt on anybody's terms. And as you can see, I'm definitely leaning away from Fleet White as a suspect in the case because I don't think the physical evidence has connected to him. And when people are arranging these scenarios, let's even say it's John Ramsey and Fleet White working together, that is purely assumptive. That is an enormous assumption, and that is almost just taking two people who are participants in the story, who are part of the story, and then they are just going to be turned into suspects. And as I've already told you in this episode, Fleet White was not the person who went around the door into the wine cellar and found JonBenet's body. That was John Ramsey. So, I mean, I think that a lot of the points that people have been making toward Fleet White as a suspect are not necessarily going to hold up under the microscope. But I told you guys in this episode that I was also going to be looking at the book We Have Your Daughter by Paula Woodward. And We Have Your Daughter isn't necessarily going to focus on a suspect like Fleet White. I think that Paula Woodward is trying to make the case that JonBenet was killed by an unnamed intruder. And yes, once again, this is a book that is going to try and exonerate the Ramseys. Of course, Lou Smith may have been the loudest voice, but Paula Woodward may have been somewhat of a close second. And there is a statement that I would like to read for you guys here from We Have Your Daughter. At one point, very early on, December 26th, there were at least 5 people, police officers, and 2 detectives in the Ramsey home. In fact, at varying times throughout the morning, there were a total of 18 family members, friends, and law enforcement personnel on the premises, mostly freely wandering the home and contaminating the crime scene and whatever evidence might have been left there. John continued his search, which was erratic. He looked in a closet, behind a chair and under a bed, picking up a magazine, and even looking in their walk-in refrigerator. In fact, the refrigerator was the first place that he looked. Now, all of those things are totally ridiculous. I mean, the fact that JonBenet was found in the basement is also somewhat ridiculous, because if they hadn't found her body yet, the ransom note stated very clearly that what? She had been kidnapped, not murdered, so looking for her under the bed. I know they had to do something, but if she were just hiding under a bed the whole time, what would be the point of the ransom note? I digress. And while telling himself to focus, he was incapable of an organized and logical search. He was trying to find his daughter, but he didn't know what else he should be looking for. He was traumatized. By the time John got to the basement, he simply wandered through some of the rooms, which were messy from the Christmas preparations, not seeing or knowing what might be out of place, until he got to the train room, the room where Burke had set up the model train on the table. It was there that John saw something that terrified him. An open, broken window with a suitcase underneath it, and a scrape mark on the wall. The suitcase would later be moved from its horizontal position along the wall to a vertical angle, as shown by a family friend. And, I guess that's going to be talking about Fleet White. The suitcase shouldn't be there, John thought. That window shouldn't be open. And what is that scrape on the wall? He immediately returned upstairs and told an officer what he had seen, and he explained that the window had been broken the summer before when he had been locked out of his home. He had gotten into that house by breaking the window, where the suitcase was normally kept under the basement stairs with the other luggage. And the window shouldn't have been open. He knew something was very wrong. And a Boulder police report added more information. Sometime before 10 a.m., John Ramsey went down into the basement to the train room, where he found the train room with the window open, so he closed it. Was that the key to everything? Well, it sounds like, in the photo, that this family friend, whom we could only gather was Fleet White, moved the suitcase into that position, but that just means turning it from horizontal to vertical during the search. And there was a different YouTuber that was addressing this when, I think it was from the Inquiry channel, when she's just saying, everybody's talking so much about this suitcase under the window and how it was used as a step, and then John Ramsey saying that shouldn't be there. But she's like, why is everybody talking about this when very clearly Fleet White was on the record as the person who had moved it? Well, as you just heard in Paula Woodward's book, he may have claimed, this family friend, Fleet White, claimed that he moved it, but that just means turning it upward, turning it from horizontal to vertical, and it still could have been used as a step. And if it didn't have anything inside it, I mean, I've thought about this. Some people think that the suitcase was put there as a step for the intruder to escape the home. Now, did that actually happen? Never been proven. That has never been certified. But if it were turned horizontal, that would be a better step, because if you were to stand on that suitcase with your full body weight as an adult male, it would probably break. I mean, I've definitely considered that, and, I'm an adult male, I would probably break that suitcase. If you were to put it horizontally, it might hold up a little bit more. But anyway, you guys can let me know what you think about that. And I will also tell you, I'm not convinced the perpetrator left through the basement window. I'm not convinced that the perpetrator used the suitcase as a step. And, I mean, are those just left there as red herrings? Or were they left there as contemplation? To anyone who actually thinks that an intruder was responsible, do you think that the suitcase was left there because somebody was thinking about using it as a step to escape through the basement window and then they changed their mind? I just don't know if there's enough evidence to support that. And I've also brought up this quotation from Call Me Chris multiple times when she's like, just because there's a scuff mark on the wall does not mean it came from an intruder. The fact of the matter is we don't know where that scuff mark came from. Let me know, do you think the perpetrator escaped through the basement window using the suitcase as a step? I just think it's unconfirmed, and I have doubts about it. Let me know what you think. But I told you guys that I would conclude today's episode with something called the Lou Smit File, where I'm mostly looking at the writings of John Wesley Anderson, who wrote the book Lou and JonBenet, and he's sharing the stories of the famed detective, whom I've mentioned before in this episode, as being the loudest voice for the intruder theory. And let's hear another story about Lou Smit. In Lou's cases, defense attorneys had a difficult challenge attempting to establish the innocence of their clients. Lou had already eliminated most defenses, such as mistaken identity, self-defense, or defense of others, and trying to prove that the suspect lacked the mental capacity to formulate intent. Now, one thing we can do with the Lou Smith file is we can apply these ideas to the Ramsey case. Let's look at number one. Most offenses. Mistaken identity. Was JonBenet killed because of mistaken identity? No, absolutely not. And unless you go with the very twisted theory that Patsy Ramsey wrote the ransom note because JonBenet was missing and she wanted to draw attention to the authorities, maybe it would help them look more quickly. And yes, that's a real theory. Some people believe that Patsy woke up, JonBenet was gone, so she wrote the ransom note to stage the scene. I don't think that happened at all. Not only do I not think that happened, we're talking about 0%, or if I can't say 0.1% chance of that happening. Why do I think that there's no case of mistaken identity? Well, the ransom note says, Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully, we have your daughter, right? So that sounds like JonBenet was specifically targeted. But that's just me. Self-defense or defense of others, absolutely impossible in the Ramsey case. That will get a 0. Trying to prove that a suspect lacked the mental capacity to formulate intent. Now, this is also something that gets a 0 in the Ramsey case. Was the person who murdered JonBenet mentally ill? To a certain degree, yes, I believe so. Would they ever be found not guilty by mental disease or defect? No. Absolutely everything that happened with the Ramsey case shows intent, it shows cover-up, conscious motivations and calculations. The ransom note itself completely shows that this person knew 100% what they were doing. The ransom note was written on the Ramsey's notepad, and then the pen that was used to write the ransom note was returned to the cup or jar that it was taken from. I really messed up those words. Cup or jar that it was taken from. That shows that this person knew exactly what they were doing. I messed up a couple words because I would just get overwhelmed with emotion telling you all of the ways that this person was a specific calculating intruder. Somebody who is tying the knot, somebody who is putting that around JonBenet's neck. All of these actions show somebody who is in complete control of their mental faculties with a specific intent. And excuse me if I said a calculating intruder, because, again, we're going to try and be as open-minded as possible. And if you think that there's a specific suspect that you've heard about in this episode where the evidence is leaning, you can let me know. But just one last thing. Lou's honesty, thoroughness, and objectivity earned him respect with prosecutors, defense attorneys, and the courts alike. Lou was the only police officer I knew to have his name and home address listed in the phone book. Before or after our shifts or on our days off, cadets were allowed to ride with uniformed officers. We weren't old enough to carry a gun or make arrests, but it was a great way to learn the job and the back alleys of the city. Some officers didn't want to be bothered with having a cadet as a rider, but most officers made us teach the ropes. We had all of our favorite patrol officers and learned which districts offered the most excitement. Sergeants were great fun to ride with because they covered half the city and didn't get stuck filling out a lot of paperwork. One of our favorite patrol sergeants to ride with was Jerry Busemeyer. I had met Jerry when I was in high school, and he raised cattle near a ranch in El Paso. I had helped Jerry work with his cattle and always admired his physical strength. 3 months into the job on a hot September night in 1972, I was assigned to work the midnight shift with the ID Bureau. Since my shift didn't start until midnight, I showed up at the department early, hoping to get a ride with Sergeant Busemeyer. When I arrived at the department, I found that my buddy, Rich Radabaugh, had beaten me to it. Reluctantly, I found another officer to ride with, but I soon found myself standing in the middle of a busy intersection, while the patrol officer sat in a parked car and filled out the paperwork. He had the windows rolled down in the cruiser, and I heard the excited voice of my friend Rich. Shots fired, and calling for assistance. The sergeant had been shot, and they pulled over a suspicious vehicle in that part of town. The driver jumped out, and gunfire erupted. My friend Rich was in the passenger seat of the patrol car when he got the radio report that shots were fired, and then the dispatcher asked Rich for their location. There was silence on the radio for a few seconds, and then Rich got back on the radio and reported the location. He later told me he didn't know where they were, and he had to get out of the police car. And he got to the nearest street sign and then back to the car. All the while the gunfire was underway. Although Jerry was shot, he was able to handcuff the suspect with Rich's help, and it turned out to be an escaped armed robber. And then the car that had been reported stolen was actually identified. Jerry was transported to the emergency room of the closest hospital. And these are just some stories from John Wesley Anderson's book, Lou and JonBenet, about the life of a patrol officer. And there's a very big transition there from Lou Smith's observations about eliminating suspects to the story of the gunfire. But I definitely like including those things all the same because it provides a window into the training, life, and experiences of a police officer. And that's ultimately why I do the file segment at the end. But you can also let me know what you think about the elimination of suspects. I'd say everything in the Ramsey case is ultimately calculated. The perpetrator's completely aware of what they're doing. They might have deranged thinking, but that doesn't necessarily mean maniacal thinking. It just means that they are destructive, homicidal, and this was a sexual predator who murdered JonBenet. And now, do you think that that is pushing toward an intruder? Or do you think that that indicates that it's one of the Ramseys? And I have to be honest with you, I think that Fleet White is somewhat of a poor suspect in the Ramsey case. I don't think he did it, but if you do, feel free to challenge me on that. You guys know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan, and there is always blackboxned88 on Instagram. And I use these pages to release shorts and reels Monday through Friday talking about serial killers, true crime news, and anything under the sun or in the darkness. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88. And that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And I'll be with you tomorrow for a new episode about Jack the Ripper. Until next time.